Thank you very much for having me here. Bonjour. Despite my fairly thick French accent, I will give this presentation in English because I'm absolutely unable to talk intelligently about my work in French, unfortunately. My name is Nicolas. I'm at Carnegie Mellon University, based in Pittsburgh. We have a fairly important hockey game tonight. We'll win. And so what I'm going to talk about is a research that, a piece of research that we've been engaging in for the past, at this point, about 10 years. And we call it security analytics. And what it means is that we try to collect as much data as we can, fairly similar to what Matthew was talking about, and then from that data, extrapolate some knowledge and find out how to design better defenses. So I'm a computer scientist by training. So what I do is, I measure stuff, I collect stuff, and then I try to build systems. And so we've realized that large-scale data collection can actually help us build potentially much better defenses. So let me start with something that is relatively common, the traditional view of security. All of us who've taught some security or cybersecurity, information security, or computer security classes, all of us have a slide like the one in the corner where we're explaining students that when you're facing an adversary, they're basically super bad, right? They can do pretty much everything except inventing new math. But other than that, they can inject messages in the network, they can do whatever they want. And that's a good assumption to start from if you're an engineer and you want to build something that is resilient, right? When you build a new bridge, you don't want to say, well, it will be okay if you're on the bridge with a bicycle or tricycle or a motorcycle. Maybe if you're driving a car, the bridge won't collapse. If you're driving a truck, all bets are off. You don't want to do that. So that's the reason why we're using those attackers models. And likewise, we assume that defenders actually care. They really try to protect their assets. So basically what we do is that we assume that this is what the way the world looks like. You've got super evil entities that are fighting white knights in shining armor. In practice, though, for the vast majority of cases, this is not what happens. You don't have, such levels of expertise in display. What you have is something that looks more like that, right? So you've got a bunch of attackers that actually are financially interested. They're economically rational. A lot of them are not particularly competent. And they are heavily reliant on commoditization, which means that there's a few people, there's a few actors that are really, really good at what they're doing. And essentially, the services that they provide are being turned into commodities for consumption by others. Now, there's an exception to this, nation-state actors. That's a story for a different talk. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. Nation-state actors, for certain nations, are extremely strong, obviously. But when we are talking about, for instance, potential manipulation of online discourse by certain powers, I'm not going to go into details, what you really see very often is that there is actually, again, this commoditization. They don't use their best people from the super secret service. They essentially subcontract that to hired guns that are not particularly apt technologically. So those attackers, again, rely a lot on commoditization, which means that there is a money flow, right? You purchase services from a different party. And that's really what we're going to try to get at in this research. Likewise, we assume that the defenders do care about what they do in terms of security, and the sad truth is, most of the time, they don't. They've got a job to do. They have a mission to accomplish, and that's what they care about. They don't care about, security primitives that they have to implement or to use. So the overarching thesis behind all of the work that my group does is that incentives and biases of both the attackers and the defenders really shape online security, and therefore they're key to trying to improve online security. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to talk about one specific technique that we are using, which is network measurements, to try to figure out what those incentives look like. And I'm going to be presenting essentially materials from two groups of papers. The first set of papers, those two papers, are on unlicensed sales of pharmaceutical goods online. The third paper here, second theme of the talk, is about sale of narcotics online. So we're going to talk about drugs a lot. Okay, so think about this. How many of you have ever received email advertisements for Viagra or other drugs? Yeah, pretty much everybody, right? I mean, if you haven't, you don't have an email address. How many of you have bought such goods from those? No, don't answer that. Statistically, it's probably going to be close to 0 in this room. And the reason is there's about one purchase that is made every 10 to 15 million emails sent for these goods. It doesn't work very well. I mean, in terms of advertising methods, it's not something that is very profitable. It's very akin to your mailbox getting stuffed with coupons for stuff that you don't care about, right? So that doesn't work very well. And you might say, well, it's fine because it's free, right, for the attacker. It costs nothing to send an email. That's not true. It doesn't cost nothing. It costs teeny, 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 tiny epsilon, which when you multiply it by millions and millions and millions and millions of emails that you have to send, that starts to be fairly large, even though there are economies of scale, but still you need to run a fairly large computing infrastructure to be able to actually extract some profit from those activities. So what we've seen over the past 15 years or so, 10 years maybe, is that increasingly those miscreants have started to try to find better ways of advertising their goods. And first, they moved to social network sites like Twitter or Facebook or back then Friendster. But what I'm going to talk about is their move to search engine manipulation. So the idea here is the following. Google made its business not on providing search. Google is an advertising company, and they're a very good advertising company. And people engaging in this kind of activities of trying to peddle illicit goods realize that. Now, you cannot buy a Google ad for counterfeit Viagra. Actually, back in the day, you could. And that got Google into a lot of trouble. And they had to pay actually a $500 million fine because they were not filtering out improper ads. So nowadays, it's pretty hard if you're running an unlicensed pharmacy to purchase actual Google ads. So what do you do? Well, what you do is that you compromise a bunch of machines, so compromise a bunch of web servers. You have them point at each other, so they are going to be propped up into the Google results. And you have them send visitors to pharmacies in response to queries for, say, Viagra online and things like that. So we decided to measure how often this happened. And so what we did is that for about 3 years and a half, close to 4 years, we ran more than 200 queries related to drugs daily. And we collected the top search results that we got from Google, and then we analyzed them. What this slide says is blah, 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 lots of data. Essentially, what we have collected is literally millions of results from Google searches pertaining to drugs. And the other thing that this slide says is that whenever you're trying to run a longitudinal data collection effort, you should be prepared for lots of really annoying low-level details. It's not just a matter of just turning it on and waiting 4 years and writing a paper about it. You really have to actively maintain it. It's not that easy. And there are scientific problems, which I won't bore you with, but which have to deal with reconciliation of data and statistical methods that you need to use whenever some data that was available at some point in time is not available later. So what did we see? Well, we saw that over time, which is what the x-axis shows on this graph, the proportion of web pages that were actually compromised, that had been hijacked, if you will, to advertise or redirect to pharmaceutical stores was clearly increasing. That's this black line, which, as you can see, between 2011 and 2013 went from about a quarter of the results to close to, well, to over half of the results, and then decreased a little bit. We also saw that certain events had or had no effect on, no discernible effect on this curve. Now, I want to caution that here what I have is temporal correlation. I don't have causation because I don't work for somebody who actually breaks into those websites. But we've been able to see potential correlations, potential temporal correlations between certain types of events and their impact. But I won't go into this. What I'm going to go into is something that I think is a little bit more interesting, which is uncovering relationships in search results. So typically what happens is that, let's say that you search for Viagra online. I'm not advertising for the Viagra company, by the way, but you search for them, and you get a bunch of search results, right? Your Google results. And let's say that one of them is something, blah, 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 UMass.edu. This actually happened. No, UMass is not in the business of selling counterfeit drugs, but their website had been compromised. It's not the UMass.edu website, it's some somewhat obscure faculty webpage 2 or 3 levels deep. When you click on that link, you do go to the UMass website, and then automatically the piece of malware that has been injected in a site sends you to what I'm going to call a traffic broker. It's a site that doesn't do anything. It's a website that doesn't do anything. It just takes traffic in and sends it out somewhere else. Think of it as like a traffic cop, right? I mean, it's not the destination. It's just a person who is redirecting you to the right destination. And then eventually it sends you to, in that specific case, something that was called menshealthpharmacy.com. Looked totally legit. People were wearing white coats. So if I think about it, I'm a computer scientist. To me, this is like, OK, there's a bunch of nodes, right, that I'm visiting. And there's a bunch of links between those nodes. Hey, that's a graph. I know how to analyze those things. So I repeat the same thing over the entire data corpus. And maybe another search result was for bitbooks.com that redirected to something called whatever.info before landing on a pharmacy. Now, I look at those redirection chains, right, through our entire data set, those millions of search results that we got. And what we did realize is that, well, sometimes there are connections between nodes that we naively wouldn't have necessarily thought had any connection. So what happened in the end is that we realized, and this came to us as a surprise, we thought when we run this over the whole data, what's going to happen is that there's going to be clusters, right, nodes that are connected to each other. And those clusters are essentially going to define pretty much who are the different actors that are operating those sites, right? If you're all connected, you probably are operated by the same person. It turns out that this is not the case. What we saw is that the entire network was basically a big giant blob. So student who was doing this came to me and said, I don't understand, it looks like there's one guy behind all of the pharmacies online. And I'm like, nah, that doesn't sound right. So then we looked into it a bit more. And what we realized is that the entities in purple are actually advertisers, right? I mean, they're people who are in the business of advertising for pharmacies, but they are not the pharmacists themselves. They are people who sell traffic to pharmacists. And so that's the reason why everything is connected. It's because those advertisers will happily work for somebody and their competitor. In our graph, that results in people being connected. So that wasn't the right, I mean, looking at this in terms of clusters was not necessarily the right approach. But what is more interesting is that when you look at this graph, what this graph shows is when you look at, when you look at this graph, and you graphically represent the in degree and the out degree of each node, meaning the number of links coming in and out of each node, you can very clearly distinguish 3 patterns. Nodes that have a very large in degree and no out degrees are essentially at the end of the line. They're the pharmacies. Nodes that are with no in degree but a large out degree are web servers that have been compromised that send traffic to others. But what's more important are the nodes that are in the middle, right? Those are those purple nodes, those traffic brokers. And what we realized is that there's not that many of those nodes. And they could be targeted for removal. So essentially, the message from this research was, if you want to go after unlicensed pharmacies, don't go after unlicensed pharmacies. Go after the people who advertise for the unlicensed pharmacies. Because there's a lot less of them, it's a lot more tractable, and you're going to have a lot more impact. Besides, what we realized is that those traffic brokers, those nodes that are on the network, are disproportionately hosted on very, very few networks. In fact, here, what I'm plotting is the number of redirection chains, which is more or less the fraction of all traffic brokers that are hosted on a given autonomous system. An autonomous system is an administrative entity that governs a specific network. So Carnegie Mellon is an autonomous system. I'm pretty sure that University of Quebec is an autonomous system. Well, Google is an autonomous system. Amazon is an autonomous system, and so forth. And what we realized is that the vast majority of those traffic brokers were hosted on one such autonomous system. Somebody is really rotten. Let's go put this person in prison. Well, so that's US1, right? I mean, this is this black thing. Anybody knows what US1 was? Wants to hazard a guess? No, it's not the Russian criminal syndicate. First of all, they're based in the US. Well, yeah, it's actually Amazon. It's AWS. Those guys were hosting it on AWS. Why? Pretty cheap, even free, right? Below a certain tier. And then at some point, it took Amazon 2 years to realize what was going on, but if you look at this here, somebody decided to turn off the, to just kick these guys out, and then what they did was to move to a different provider based in the Netherlands. So what this tells you is that those traffic brokers are mostly hosted on the same network, so essentially those sites that are instrumental, those linchpins of advertising are hosted on the same networks. The structure doesn't really change over time, and it seems that opportunities for takedowns are ripe. However, you've got jurisdiction issues. In the first case, you were at Amazon. That's fine. You can go after them if you're the FBI. But as soon as they move to the Netherlands, it starts to be a little bit harder. And if, God forbid, they move to Russia or China, it's going to be really hard. However, the point here is that, yes, it seems like we're engaging in an arms race. However, it's an arms race that might be winnable because every time you displace those miscreants, there's a reason why they were on Amazon in the first place. It's because it was dirt cheap. You're raising the bar a little bit. You're making them pay a little bit more. On the other hand, their profit margins don't really, their profits do not really increase by switching from one server to another. They're still selling, the same type of stuff, traffic to pharmacies in that case. So making the attack increasingly less profitable might be a way of getting out of this arms race, might be a way for the defenders to win. Okay, I'm told I've got 3 minutes, so I'll take 4.5 because I can do that, to talk briefly about the second part of this presentation I wanted to bring up. So far, this is what we've been looking at, right? Smiling couple, white lab coats, totally legit. Let's talk a bit about the evolution of illicit internet commerce toward this type of website. So this is something that David has been also studying a lot with his colleagues. And it's an online anonymous marketplace where basically people can trade in whatever they want, as long as you're confining yourself, in the case of Silk Road, to drugs and things that don't harm others. It's fine to harm yourself, but not harming others in the case of Silk Road. So those websites were known as the Amazon.com of illegal goods. You could find drugs, you could find credit cards and fake IDs. On some of them, you can find weapons. You never find any child pornography on those marketplaces because, well, they're common criminals. They don't like people who peddle child pornography in the first place. And they really don't want to touch that. Child pornography is kind of its own ecosystem, and we're not studying it. Those online anonymous marketplaces provide, safety, convenience, variety, accountability, competition, much like eBay and, Amazon Marketplace do. The reason why they're able to survive is that they're using anonymizing technologies, such as the Tor network. Bitcoin is used for payments. Bitcoin is terrible in terms of anonymity, but it's better than using credit cards online. So it kind of raises the bar for the defender this time. And they also use encryption for communication in some cases. What we wanted to do was to draw inferences from public information. So this is a typical page on one of those sites. And here the person is selling a book, Hacking for Beginners. It is not, well, you won't go very far with what you learn in that book, but what we do see is that that page actually has a bunch of public information, right? It's got a title, it's got a seller name, seller ID, it's got a price and shipping location, and most importantly, it's got feedback. And feedback is mandatory. That's the beauty of it. So we saw this and we were like, you know what? We can actually figure out how much money these people are making, because we have the price, we know when the feedback is deposited, we know the feedback is mandatory, so we can just multiply, you know, each feedback instance by the price and just add that up for all of the items that we see in that marketplace, and we're going to get a good idea of how much this thing is grossing. So we did just that. We actually collected tons of data over years, and just keep this. And this is what we eventually got. There's some holes in the data set because collecting data is hard, and sometimes the data collection infrastructure fails. Sometimes the marketplaces themselves decide to go away. But what you do see is that you do see two things. You see that there was a first phase back in 2011 through 2013. 2011 is not represented here, but where essentially you had a monopolistic structure. There was one marketplace where everybody was going. And then this marketplace got taken down. The Silk Road, very famous case, the person ended up in prison. And what you do see is that there's a little bit of kind of a weird transition phase where we're actually missing quite a lot of data, but there's an also one that became a leading market. And then that went away too. And then after a couple of months, you start to see diversification. You start to see a more active ecosystem with multiple marketplaces that are operating at the same time, providing more diversity to the ecosystem so that if one of them goes down, vendors can go to a different marketplace. So essentially, you used to have one eBay of sorts, and now you've got like 3 or 4. And what we've seen, which was very interesting, is that this is police intervention, right? I mean, Silk Road is taken down. Well, it didn't have any effect on the total size of the ecosystem in economic terms. In fact, if anything, they sold more because they got more exposure from the press and, you know, people started to be more aware. Second police operation here, Operation Anonymous, took down this purple one called Silk Road 2, and that's very unimaginative, and a couple of others. And what this did was to simply shift the traffic to other marketplaces. Now, this data goes only until January of 2015. I'm censoring the second part. Matthew will be very familiar with that concept because that's statistical censorship. It's not, it's like in, you know, Kaplan-Meier curves where essentially what I'm saying here is that I don't have enough data for that interval to actually get something that I have any confidence showing, so I'm discarding those data points just because they were at the end of the measurement interval. But what we've seen is that this ecosystem was resilient both to law enforcement takedowns as well as to scams. Very often, operators of those marketplaces decide, hey, you know what? I'm running a fairly good business, but I've got $1 million lying on the table. Law enforcement is after me. I've got a bunch of drug dealers that don't really like me. And I am anonymous, or so I think. Why don't I just take this money and go to Belize? And a lot of people have done that, actually. The point that I wanted to make here is that rather than trying to take down those marketplaces, what we've observed is that there's actually a very, very small fraction of vendors that are responsible for most of the sales. It's really about the 1%. What this is a cumulative distribution function of the profits that vendors are making. And you can see that on average, people sell for about $500. Nothing. It's really small fish. But a few of them are selling millions of dollars of product. And some of them are already in prison. But the point is that if you want to have an impact on those marketplaces, if you think that those marketplaces are a bad thing, which is already, you know, something where we can have a little bit of a debate, going after those largest vendors is probably a much more effective strategy than going after the marketplace, because if you go after the marketplace, they will just switch to a different marketplace. If you go after Pablo Escobar, on the other hand, he's a little bit harder to replace. So I'm going to conclude here. What we do is important. Is what I like to say. But more seriously, I think this echoes also some of what Matthew was presenting in the previous presentation. Security analytics is really an important and up-and-coming field. We can collect data that we couldn't even dream of collecting 20 years ago. And this can help us come up with much more informed policy recommendations, defenses, and a much better understanding of the ecosystems that we are dealing with, be they in hate crime, in questionable online discourse, or more traditional crimes like drug dealing. So I think we'll be employed for quite a while, but I really think that we need to seize this opportunity of collecting data as much as we can and analyze it. With this, I'm going to thank you, and I will enjoy myself in one of those very nice chairs. Thank you.